My name is Nellist. I'm Socialist Party councillor in St Michael's. I get loud as I go on. Unless my eyes are deceiving me, of the 54 councillors that were invited to tonight's meeting, I may be the only one who's actually managed to make it. I actually represent the constituents who, depending on which way the wind's blowing, get the current effluent coming out of the top of the town and wood out of any new incinerator. Since the Charterhouse area, we've got the chair of the Residents Association of the Charterhouse with us here tonight as well, is where most people live who are directly affected by the points that the Professor made. The three quick points I want to make, even though I probably agree with more than the 70% John McGuigan mentioned that he agrees with the Professor, are economic ones which haven't yet been made. First, or made fully in my view. Firstly, the funding of this project is through PFI. I sat in April 1999 in the Council House when Walsgrave Hospital was costed at £174 million. We had in 1990 a proposal to modernise Coventry, Warwick and Walsgrave at 30 million each, but there isn't a profit out of modernising the existing plant. There's only a profit out of knocking it down and building a new one and then renting it back to us for 35 years. That 174 million when Walsgrave was opened was £400 million. John spoke tonight of £260 million, half of which was coming from the government. I brought with me the Grant Thornton document into the outline business case, which spoke, before that business case went 18 months ago, was approved by Council 18 months ago in March and then in October of last year, of the cost at January 2008 prices of £152 million. John tells us tonight, 18 months later, it's now costing at £260 million. In other words, PFI escalates because the commercial interests are to make it as big as possible. The other thing it does is it closes the door to commercial confidentiality and stops you as citizens and me as an elected representative of being able to open those documents and tell you where the money's going, which we can no longer do with Walsgrave Hospital. The second point is the gap. John said 260 million will cost, half from the government, we'll find the rest. 2 weeks today, if you'll give me the chance at the end, I'll give you a leaflet before you go away and invite you to come to it. The council has got a meeting to decide what's called its medium-term financial strategy. It's going to cut £72 million off spending on services over the next 3 years. Within that is the affordability gap for the waste project. It's costing next year at £500,000, the year after at £1.5 million, and the year after that at £2.5 million. That is £4.5 million of those cuts in services directly coming out of the start-up costs for this incinerator. But then when you look at the outline business case that went off to London last year, and forgive me for the two-sentence reading this out, this is what the council passed, with only a couple of us voting against. Approve that the council proceed with the PFI procurement on the basis of an affordability gap of 6.3 million for 2015-16 to 9 million for 2015-16 for the whole systems cost. That 9 million over the lifetime of the project of additional costs, affordability gap, in this document passed by the council, passed by Labour and Tory votes by the way, was £267 million over 25 years. Now, the costs in 2 weeks' time of the cuts of £4.5 million over 3 years of start-up costs, or £9 million a year according to that document. I think that £9 million, by the way, is some 200 to 300 jobs in the council that will have to go in order to meet that cost. So when somebody says, how do you afford to pay for costs of doing things a different way? Doing it on this economic model, the council will have to get rid of 200 to 300 jobs purely to square that circle. You've been very kind. Let me finish with this last point. We had a vote 4 weeks ago on the waste heat project that John mentioned, steam coming out of the existing incinerator. I was a county councillor, some of you may remember this far back 25 years ago in the 1980s, and I moved that waste steam heat from Whitley actually actually go to a district heating scheme for Stoke-Aldermore, so we could give some people who are only one of the poorest estates in Coventry a better form of heating in their housing. Unfortunately, it went to a Peugeot, and when Peugeot went, it hasn't gone anywhere. Now, we approved a project 4 weeks ago to apply for the government for money to send a pipeline down the London Road and to heat some buildings, including council buildings, in the city centre. And I don't have a problem with that. And I finish with this, where I do have a problem. If we agree to a 35-year model of legal contracts, where the first legal duty will be to provide payment to the builders and owners of the project, we may find this laudable aim of turning steam and waste heat into a district heating scheme becomes something that, in order to meet, we have to increase the amount that's burnt, not decrease it, in order to get the same amount of electricity coming out of the plant to provide that waste. That, to me, is the economics of madness. That is quite simply crazy. This plant could last another 10 or 15 years. 2023 is the estimate of when it needs to be replaced. I suspect that could be stretched. I think we have 10 or 12 years to explore the ideas that Keith and the Professor, I do forgive Paul, I don't know your full name, that's why I can refer to you as a Professor, my apologies for that discourtesy. I think we've got more time to explore these ideas and make sure that we reduce to the absolute minimum what we can no longer reuse or recycle or find a different use for before we get locked in to an economic model that may actually say to social services, care of the elderly and other things, we can't afford people to work in those services because we've got to pay the shilling to the people that own the incinerator. That's why when it comes back, social
And regarding what you said about cities and the money going away from services, essential services, I remember Neil Seltman, who heads up the Centre for Institute for Local Self-Reliance. He was talking about Detroit, where they built the largest incinerator in the world. He says, Paul, you can talk about how many people are going to die from dioxin, but I'm going to tell you right now, more people are going to die in Detroit because to pay for this, they're going to have to remove money from social services. And they were absolutely right. They cut the salaries of the civil employees, they cut back on the police force, and they cut back on the fire service to pay for this monstrosity. In terms of changing the world,